Hello friends, and welcome to episode number 9 of Nostalgia Talk, and also happy first day of December. So today on Nostalgia Talk I have a very cool guest with me, another friend, Joe Mathieu. Welcome to the show, Joe.
How you doing, James? Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Now, for the viewers who are not aware, Joe is a Sesame Street book illustrator. He has been with Sesame Street for a long time, not only doing books, but doing merchandise as well. Among some of the books he's done have included Cookie Monster and the Cookie Tree, the Ernie and Bert Book, Grover and the Everything in the Whole Wide World Museum, I Want to Go Home, Sesame Street Dictionary, and apart from Sesame Street, also was the writer and illustrator of the books Big Joe's Trailer Truck and Busy City, and also illustrated one of my favorite books from my childhood, Dogs Don't Wear Sneakers. And I actually have a copy of that right here. And it was actually sent to me by Joe a few years ago, and he even signed it for me. So let's get right into it. So first question, how did you become interested in illustration and drawing?
See, that goes back a long ways. I think I always drew. I mean, I have drawings that I did at 3 years old, that sort of thing.
Nice.
I started very, very young. By kindergarten, I was drawing Disney characters, particularly Captain Hook and Peter Pan and Tinkerbell and all that from the movie. And so I got a lot of attention in kindergarten.
Right.
I was very shy. I didn't like people to see my work. But I liked it at the same time. And I drew really quite a lot in grade school when I was very young. I think what really got me going was secondary school. I didn't go to a high school. I went to a small prep school.
Mm-hmm.
I would describe it as a somewhat Dickensian atmosphere. It was a difficult place to get along. It was a boarding school, and I was a day student. It was run by priests, and we didn't have any art in the school. There were no art classes offered.
Oh.
And I was not really happy there. The boarders didn't like the day students because they got to go home and eat mom's cooking every day and that sort of thing. And I started doing caricatures just as a reaction to this. And I was caricaturing the teachers at first. And that got me a lot of attention. Suddenly I was much more popular. So I enjoyed it a lot. I followed that. I became the school. We had a wonderful school paper, very high quality. And I just filled it with cartoons. And of the students and the teachers, especially the ones that didn't like it. They were my favorite ones to get. And eventually we won some big award in, I don't know, Boston University or someplace, had a big ceremony, and I got to go. And so this got me curious about my potential as an illustrator, and I ended up going to art school as a result of that and pursuing this as a career. That's about how I got started, really, but I just always drew.
Nice. Same here. I was always into drawing what I was seeing on TV, mostly Sesame Street and Disney, so we're coming from the same place, basically.
And the Muppets, I fell in love with them early, too. This is before Sesame Street. They would be guests on various shows, and my parents knew that I just loved them. So they would let me stay up late or get up early and skip school or whatever it was if Jim Henson and the Muppets were going to be on. So when Sesame Street came around, I thought, wow, that's really cool. But I didn't actually realize that there was any work possibilities there. I just liked them. And people would say, well, why don't you go to the Children's Television Workshop as I shopped my wares around New York City. And I don't know, it didn't seem, I wanted to go to book publishers. That didn't seem like a good place to go because they weren't actually doing books yet. So that came about by accident, really. I was looking for work and leaving samples around New York, and the people at Random House who got the license to publish Sesame Street books were looking for the person to start this whole thing, I guess. They wanted someone with a little bit more up-to-date look or something, and apparently I had left my samples around, and they got into the right hands, I thought this guy could be the one, and I ended up doing some of the first books, and I think setting a lot of the tone for the books anyway. I really enjoyed what I saw on TV with the early Sesame Street shows, which was basically a somewhat blighted urban atmosphere. It wasn't the
Right.
cheeriest set you ever saw. It was a kind of a dumpy neighborhood, you know?
Yeah, basically, it was very much of an inner city kind of neighborhood in the early
exactly.
stuff.
And I loved it because I didn't come from the inner city. So when I went into New York, I was looking at everything like it was new. And I made a point of learning how to draw that look. I mean, when you saw this sort of dull, kind of dark atmosphere, and Big Bird walked in, it was gorgeous. He was such a ray of sunshine.
Absolutely.
And all the Muppets, I love that juxtaposition of the bright colors and against the sort of dark background. And in the early days, I used to go to the set quite a lot and watch the show being taped. And it looked just like that, really. On the outside, it looked like Sesame Street. There was a stage door that was in an old theater. The theater itself was kind of closed. There was paper on the windows and everything. But there was a stage door around the back. I think it was 81st Street. It was a dump. There were kids playing baseball back there and throwing the ball up against the brick building. And I'm thinking, they have no idea that on the other side of that wall is Sesame Street. I just thought that was great. And I went so often that the guy at the door, the guard, thought I worked there. So I would just walk in. That was a lot of fun.
Well, technically you did work with them. Maybe not on the set, but technically you did kind of work with them. So
I eventually became part of the group, yeah.
Right.
And I got the okay from Jim. I told him I wanted to learn how to draw these characters, that I would need to see them and draw them and study them.
Right.
Basically handle them. And he told me that I could go anytime to what they called the Muppet morgue. And said, you just call so-and-so and, they'll let you in. And the morgue was basically, it looked like a real morgue. And there were drawers
My God.
on the wall. And it had names on the drawers, like Ernie and Bert Grover and everything. And you pull the drawer and he's laying there, And that was just great. So I did that quite a lot, actually.
Visiting the Muppet morgue, that sounds so, like, in today's world, that sounds so cryptic.
There's Don Saline was in there back then. He was one of the early builders.
Right.
Maybe the best one they ever had. I don't know. But he built Ernie and Bert, for example. He was just amazing. He was always there with a couple laughs and nice guy.
Yeah, from what I've heard about Don Saline, he's a bit of a prankster.
That's what I heard. I didn't know him that well. I would just see him when I was in there to go to the morgue.
Hmm. So what was Jim Henson like? Every time I have a guest on the show who's worked with Jim Henson at some point, I always ask what he was like. What did you think of him?
Well, to me, he was a star. I just thought he was a genius. And but he was basically a soft-spoken, very, very nice guy who would always listen to your ideas and that sort of thing. And he was willing to do it. And as a matter of fact, in the early days, he used to look at the drawings. He was the only one that could approve a sketch before it went into finish.
You mean like, do you mean like illustration drawings or puppet drawings?
Illustration drawings.
Okay.
Nowadays they have blue liners, they call them, right, which are evil people with blue pencils who go in there and mark up your drawings and fix them and make them more Disney-esque or whatever you want to call it. They've got this sort of more formal idea. Back then, Jim wanted everyone to sort of draw them their own. He wanted you to draw the Muppets your own way. He wasn't looking for a Disney-esque, everyone draw the same way type codified version. And but there were certain things.
Right.
And the thing that was very different from drawing the characters with Jim than with an art director later on. I mean, the art directors are wonderful and everything, but who can replace Jim Henson? These were his concepts. These characters existed in his mind, and the cartoon was almost as valid an expression of that character as the puppet. So you weren't really drawing the puppet, you were drawing the character the way he saw it. So that sometimes there was a limitation in what could be done with a puppet. And he'd say, well, don't draw it that way. I'd say, I know, Jim, but that's the way it looks on the puppet. Yes, but that's because we can only build him a certain way. But this is the way I see the character. So I got all these bad ideas in my head, which made me draw the wrong sometime by today's standards. You know.
Sounds like Jim really knew his stuff then.
Jim kind of knew what he was talking about. Yes, that's right. But it was fun to have that first-hand introduction to the characters.
Right.
That was unbelievable, really. For example, like Grover or Bert, they have these mouths that look, basically the head is kind of sliced like a melon, and the head opens up to work the mouth. And so from a full face point of view, he didn't want you to make the mouth go all the way around to the ears. So the mouth would be drawn inside that. He just thought that's the way it should look. And nowadays, of course, the art directors blue liners have you draw the Muppet the way it's made on the puppet, because they don't probably never talk to Jim about that, you know. Right.
With the mouth going right to the ears, sounds like a Muppet version of Mr. Crocker from the Fairly Odd Parents. So
I think the original Grover, I think, was made from a plastic bowling ball.
I think you're right. I think I had heard that.
So, anyway, go ahead.
Well, do you remember the very first book that you ever did for Sesame Street?
Yes. It's a complex answer, because the very first book I illustrated for Sesame Street didn't have any Muppets in it.
Oh.
It was one of the first books to be done for Sesame Street. It was called something like 4 Stories by Gordon. So on the cover there's Gordon reading to these kids. Michael Frith did the cover, and there were 4 illustrators that illustrated the 4 stories. Mm-hmm. I illustrated one of the stories, which was a thrill for me, because there were a couple of my favorite artists in the book with me. And mine was about a superhero named Fisherman who saved the oceans of the world from pollution. There was this evil polluter and all that sort of thing. So that was the first book I participated in. I didn't illustrate the whole thing. And I don't know, maybe a year after that, I was Michael Frith, who was the art director then at Random House. He asked me to illustrate some Muppet characters, and that's what really got me going in it. Michael Frith eventually became the art director at Muppets. He left Random House to go full time with Jim, and that was around the time of the beginning of the Muppet Show. So he designed a lot of the characters for that.
I think he did Fozzie.
Probably, yes. Probably so. Yeah. I know he did Dr. Teeth and the whole band, the Electric Mayhem.
Right.
But he was great. He really made my career. He was sort of my idol back then. I thought he was great.
Nice. Well, shout out to Michael Frith if you are watching this. So, you said your first book was illustrating Gordon. Do you find it difficult illustrating the human cast of Sesame Street as opposed to the Muppet cast?
Great question. I always enjoyed drawing them. I mean, it was difficult. And I felt that I was one of the few who could do that. It's one thing to draw a Cookie Monster. It's another thing to draw Maria. And I was called upon to draw a lot of the books that required the full cast, the humanoid cast. One of the more fun fun ones was Christmas Eve on Sesame Street, which was a television special. And back then we didn't have VCRs. They were just coming out. So you had to draw them, while you watched the show, you had to draw really fast. My parents happened to have a VCR, which was one of the first ones. It cost a fortune at the time. And I was given a copy of the show, and I could study it on tape, which was great. It was really brand new thing. But you couldn't pause it and draw it.
Yikes.
It would break up. You couldn't pause anything. So you had to just keep playing it through. So it was very difficult to do. But that was a fun book. I enjoyed doing that book. A difficult book to illustrate because it was written by John Stone, who was the head writer and director of the show at various times. And he had certain ideas, and he was very demanding. I had to do the cover a couple of times.
Oh.
But it was all for the better. I was very proud of that book, actually. But on the other side of the coin, one of the other books that had the humanoid characters in it was I'll Miss You, Mr. Hooper.
Right.
Which had to do with the death of Will Lee and Mr. Hooper. He actually died on the show. And I had to draw them in a very sad mode, that sort of thing. I remember talking with Bob McGrath about that, and he couldn't talk about it without falling apart, frankly. He said, we did that show in one take. He said, we couldn't do it twice. It was too difficult emotionally.
Right.
But those are a couple of the books. So we used to do a lot of books with the human characters in them. These days, you never see the human characters. It's all Muppets. I haven't drawn them now for years. But I felt I was proud of the way I could draw them because that took a little extra illustrating ability to draw the human characters. I think there was also a book about Susan and Gordon adopt a baby or have a baby. I don't remember if that was. And there were others, but like I said, nowadays they stay away from the human characters.
Yeah, they've got the human characters they have on the show now. There's Alan, Chris, and Nina. Did you see the 50th anniversary special for Sesame Street?
Yes, I did. Yes.
And all the humans, Bob, Gordon, Susan, Maria, Luis, they were all in that, and I really liked seeing them again.
Yes. I think Carol Spinney showed up on that too.
Yeah, he did. Him and Deborah and Fran Brill was in that as well. I thought that was very sweet.
Yes.
And for any of the viewers who aren't aware of who Carol Spinney is, other than just watching the first few seconds of the video, Carol Spinney was Big Bird and Oscar. He just passed away last year. He did both those characters for about 50 years. What a legacy he's left.
What a great performer. What a pro and amazing person. I have a great story to tell you.
Okay.
Carol Spinney came from the next town over from where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And in Connecticut. And he used to buy, my father owned a Ford Mercury dealership. Carol Spinney was a customer.
Mm-hmm.
He used to buy cars from my dad. And he used to go in there and hang around and talk about what he was doing. And at the time, this is before Sesame Street, he used to play a character on Providence Television, on the Providence Bozo the Clown show. He was Mr. Lion. It was a full body costume. And he was amazing. He would take a kid out of the audience, ask the name, write the name on a big piece of paper, and make an animal out of it.
Oh.
It sounds ridiculous. It was the most clever thing you ever saw. I don't know how he did it. It was fantastic. And one day he went in to tell my dad that he got this new gig. There was a public television show that's going to be really big, and he was going to play this 8-foot-tall bird. And this was Big Bird. And at the time, he was still doing his own puppet show, his act, which he would drive all around the country going to different puppet festivals and this sort of thing. And when he was out west somewhere, his car caught fire.
Yikes.
burned the puppets.
Ooh. I had heard a story about the Big Bird puppet, the first Big Bird puppet catching on fire.
I don't know that one. I've never heard that. But these were Carol's own puppets. And he went back to my dad and said, look, I understand it's not your fault. You didn't build the car. But I'm very sorry, but I'm going to have to sue Ford Motor Company. My dad said, yeah, I don't blame you. But apparently, when you get into the suing thing, you have to sue everybody. So he ended up suing my father as well. Well, Ford Motor Company got out of it. So he spent the next 20 or 30 years in court with my dad, apparently. And when I first met him at Muppets, someone said, this is a new artist, and he's starting to draw the characters for Jim. And his name is Joe Mathieu. And Carol said, Joe Mathieu? He said, you're not related to the Joe Mathieu, meaning my father. I said, yes, Carol. They said, don't worry, but I understood. So for the rest of the time that I knew him, if I ran into him anywhere, he'd always say, sort of in Big Bird's voice, hey, everybody, I'm suing Joe Mathieu's dad. So I think I'm the only person whose dad was ever sued by Big Bird.
That's actually hilarious. That's hilarious. So when you illustrate your books for Sesame Street, I've noted, like in some books like Sesame Street Dictionary or others, I've noticed little cameos from characters like Roosevelt Franklin, Harvey Knee Slapper. Do they often tell you who to put in certain pages, even though some of those characters don't really have a major part in the story at all?
Yeah, it really depended on the book. Some books came with a lot of art direction, and some books came with next to none or none. For a while there, when I was really, when things were really cooking, you know, there was a much broader audience for Sesame Street a few decades ago. You know, the demographic was from preschool to second grade or something.
Mm-hmm.
And as times changed, that morphed into, I think it's pretty much preschool now.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have those older, so some of the books were targeted to an older child. So I think there was more writing, they were a little more grown up, and like when we were drawing the human characters, that sort of thing. That had a little older look. So now it's aimed at a younger demographic. Forgot why I got into that. What was your question?
Do they often tell you which characters to put in certain pages?
Yes. So for a while, sometimes they would just give me a loose concept. I would go into New York and they'd sit me down. Publisher would sit me down and say, well, we want a book that does this, that, and the other thing. Start here and there. And I would illustrate the book with no manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
So I could put in whatever characters I wanted to. So I would just pick, a lot of times, the character that I thought was appropriate for something. Like in the Sesame Street Dictionary, there was every character that had ever been on the show, I think, up to that point.
Oh, yeah.
And there are other books. There was a book called Big Bird's Big Book that it was a monstrous book. It's like 3 feet tall, a couple feet wide, which opened to like 4 feet wide. And it was drawn still on a small scale, like a small book. So I could put hundreds of characters in there. And that had no manuscript. I just filled it. There were several books that were done that way.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the pop-up books, I could really just add characters or take them away at will. And that was great. That's not very much of that done today. Things are pretty well ironed out. But yes, I could use all the obscure characters, and that was a lot of fun. Sometimes I just make them up. I'd do a caricature of a friend as a Muppet, or someone that I worked with in New York. They were populated with a lot of actual real people that were sort of Muppetized.
Nice. I've occasionally done that with my writing. Like I'll base some characters off of people that I know.
Yeah, that's the grand tradition. It's using what you have. For example, I used to use our furniture in a lot of the interiors. I mean,
Nice.
I have to come up with a living room or a kitchen or whatever. Well, what am I going to draw? Well, I got a deadline. I got to do something fast. I do what's in front of me. You know, I'll use the furniture in front of me. So a lot of the other illustrators, thinking that Joe Mathieu was the guy who knew everything about this stuff, they assumed that I knew what Ernie and Bert's kitchen looked like, which didn't exist. I just made it up. But it was actually our furniture, that sort of thing. So in one of the books, for example, it was Big Bird visits his granny. And his granny at the time didn't really exist. It was just another Big Bird with a bun and a nightie and some little glasses on, that sort of thing. And in this book, I think Granny Bird was sick. She had a bad cold or something, and she was in bed. Big Bird went to visit her. Well, I put a nightgown on Granny Bird because she was in bed, and I used one of my wife's nightgowns.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it was a nice frilly thing with flowers on it and everything. It was perfect for Granny Bird. Well, then when some other books came out that other illustrators had illustrated, they were wearing the same nightgown. Granny Bird was wearing the same nightgown, and I thought that was funny. And they said, you know, I stole your nightgown. Yes, I know. That wasn't really a Granny prop. That was my wife's nightgown.
I'll have to look back on episodes of the show that Granny Bird was in to try to be able to tell if they actually ended up making that prop eventually from your illustration.
Probably not, but our furniture ended up in other people's books too, so I could always tell who was being influenced by my books. I'd recognize the stuff.
Funny. So for some projects, such as one I mentioned in the intro, the Ernie and Bert book, Grover's Little Red Riding Hood, and especially the projects you were mentioning before, Christmas Eve on Sesame Street and I'll Miss You, Mr. Hooper, those came from the show itself. Like the Ernie and Bert book, which is where Ernie tries to persuade Bert to put a pot on his head, and he's like, well, why should I put a pot on my head? Well, because I broke this. Well, what'd you do with what goes in it?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Grover's Little Red Riding Hood came from a Sesame Street newsflash skit with Kermit.
Oh, yeah.
And if anyone is interested in watching that skit, I'll put a link to it in the corner of the video. So when you do these projects that come from the show, do you get the chance to kind of watch them?
To watch the episode?
Yeah.
Well, in the case of that particular one, as I was saying, there were no VCRs then. That's even before my parents had one. I went all the way into New York. They had a professional player at Sesame Workshop. Big giant machine.
Like a projector?
It wasn't a projector. It actually, you saw the image on a monitor, but it was a big professional thing. You wouldn't have this in a home. It was too big. Mm-hmm. Giant VCR, basically. And I wanted to see it. I wanted to study the episode. I mean, because you didn't know when it was going to be on TV or anything. You couldn't see it on TV. So I went all the way into New York, which I think was a 4-hour trip, to sit there and watch them play that episode over and over and over and over while I did drawings. I can see a pad from here. They're actually in that pad. I could show them to you. Scenes from that episode of Little Red Riding Hood, was it? Yes. Yep. Yes.
So one project that you illustrated, The Exciting Adventures of Super Grover, was later developed into a home video, and I have a copy of that home video. And there were a couple other books that you illustrated for Sesame Street, such as Ernie's Big Mess, Bert and the Missing Mop Mix-Up, Two Wheels for Grover, and those were later adapted into the Start to Read videos.
I had no idea. Well, I didn't know those were episodes, but I know the books.
Well, the books basically for the videos, like they weren't adapted onto the show, but basically they were stills of the books that were put into the videos.
I forgot all about that. That's right.
Yeah, I have the whole VHS collection of all of them.
Oh wow, yes, I remember when we did those. That was very early on in the whole video thing.
Right.
And in some cases, I redid whole scenes from those books where I would draw the whole background without the characters. And then I would do the characters on a separate piece of paper and cut them out with a razor blade and put them in an envelope and send that in with the background. And they'd sort of walk the characters across. It was all very primitive. You know, we didn't have digital imaging or anything.
That's clever. I had always because I noticed that for the exciting adventures of Super Grover, there was a lot more animation in it. Like there's a moment where Super Grover's flying through the sky and bashes into a wall, and you can see him kind of crouched as he's bashing into it. That it was more like if you've ever seen any of the Marvel or DC films, it was a lot like that.
Yeah, I don't even remember. I don't think I've even seen that one. Okay. But that was a very popular book. Super Grover was a popular character.
Yeah.
He was great.
So the Start to Read videos, they actually had like words at the bottom of the screen so that kids could read along with them. Were those meant to be more educational?
Yes. The educational value was considered important, and again, it was a different demographic, different audience. So we're older kids that were learning to read, that sort of thing, which I think was a little older at that time, a little more advanced.
Right. So when you're illustrating the Muppets on Sesame Street, do you ever think about, because you know, I notice a lot of certain specific things that the puppeteers will do when they're performing their characters, like the movements and the mannerisms. Do you ever take that into consideration when you're illustrating?
Absolutely. To me, the magic, the life of the Muppets is in the character, is in the performers' movements and everything.
Right.
You know, that's just magic. I think you have to draw them. You have to try to draw them the way they're performed. I've always believed that. The first time I ever met Jim Henson and Frank Oz, I tell this story too often, so I don't want to. I don't want to bore you with it, but I met them at a photo shoot. Michael Frith had taken me to a photo shoot. I think the studio was right next to the original Muppet building before the mansion. They called it the Carriage House. Mm-hmm. And I think it was right next to that. There was this guy. He was shooting them, and it was kind of fairly late in the evening. And I got to see this photo shoot. I couldn't believe it. This is the first time I'd actually been to anything like this. And they had I think they were shooting a calendar. Mm-hmm. And they had these complicated scenes all set up, and all the Muppets were stuck on metal frames of some sort. And they would pose the character, hold the character in a certain pose around the table or whatever they were doing. And the characters looked pretty dead, frankly. And, you know, they were stuck on these metal frames. And Jim, I just had met Jim, and I talked with him and all this sort of thing. I told him I wanted to do the Muppet Morgue thing and this, that, and the other thing. And who eventually came in but Frank Oz. And, you know, this is, for me, this is incredible. So I got to meet Frank Oz, and Frank Oz, he saw Grover on this metal frame. And he went over to the frame and took Grover off the frame and put him on. And Grover came to life. It was absolutely magical. Wow. Grover just, and he like, you know, he kind of shook his head, shook the sleep away, because Frank had been on vacation for a couple of weeks. So he hadn't seen Grover for a couple of weeks, and he finds him on this metal stand. So Grover looks around, and he finally sees Frank, and like reacts to Frank's presence. Mm-hmm. You know, this is unbelievable to me. And Grover said hello to Frank, and Frank said hello to Grover, and did you have a nice vacation or something like that? And he says, yes, but and he leans in close to Frank and he says, "Frank, you promised me that if you left, no one would stick anything up there." The middle frame.
The very dark humor side of Sesame Street.
Yes. And everybody split up laughing. And but that's why that magical quality. That's why I used to go to the set. I used to spend all day sitting in a corner, trying to be out of the way. These are all people running around and they're busy. You know, they're moving props and they're moving this and that. There are guests that they're trying to usher around and everything. So I would just tuck myself away and I'd sit there all day and watch them. And I would try to get that a clear image of that magic in my head so that I could draw the way they moved.
Nice.
Based on, you know.
Nice. It's funny you were mentioning Jim's, Jim Henson and Frank Oz's dark humor. I was just talking to Patrick Bristow. Do you know who that is?
No.
He's an improv actor who's been on basically so many sitcoms, and he's doing Puppet Up, an improv show with Brian Henson. And it's not like the Muppet Show or Sesame Street. It's highly adult, but you know, Patrick had said that Jim really liked dark humor like that. It doesn't really show, though.
No. Well, that's the sort of thing he would appreciate without necessarily bringing onto especially the set at Sesame Street, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember talking about Monty Python with him, though.
Oh, cool.
We'd be at a meeting, and someone would start talking about, "Did you see Monty Python last night?" That sort of thing. And he'd start talking about what was on, and he'd be laughing so hard he'd fall out of his chair. That was amazing.
I'm doing an improv. I was doing an improv course at Neptune Theatre here in Nova Scotia, and we did this. We basically did like an imitation of an old Monty Python bit. Hello, Bruce. Oh, g'day, Bruce. Oh, hey, say hello to Sheila, Bruce. So, who are some of your favorite Sesame Street Muppet characters to illustrate books for, like on a regular basis?
I always had a thing for Ernie, I think. I just always liked him. I like the Ernie and Bert things in general just because they're kind of quiet.
Mm-hmm.
And there's psychological studies in a way. But I just always loved, oh gosh, I have to tell you a great story.
Let's hear it.
In the early days, this would be like 1974.
Mm-hmm.
I think my daughter was 2 years old. She was born in 72. So I think it was 74. She was 2 years old. And I had a studio in the house, but I did not have a dedicated phone line at the time. And I refused to answer the phone because the phone was always for my wife. You know, I didn't want to interrupt my work all the time to answer the phone. And my daughter spent a lot of time in my studio. So she was hanging around and the phone rang. And she picked it up and she was talking to somebody. I assumed it was a relative, you know. And she was laughing and having a grand old time. And after a nice long conversation, she said, "Dad, the phone's for you. Phone, Dad." And I said, "Phone for me? Okay." I said, "Who is it?" And she said, "It's Ernie."
So it was Jim Henson.
It was Jim Henson. Yeah, he'd been doing Ernie on that.
Right. Yeah. That's funny. That's cute. Actually, that's very cute. So apart from Sesame Street, as I mentioned at the start of the video, you were the writer and illustrator of a classic non-Sesame Street kids book, Big Joe's Trailer Truck, and that has had quite an impact.
Yes, that was wonderful. I haven't written a lot of books, but that was my first attempt, and that did really well. It was translated into a bunch of languages and that sort of thing, which I never saw coming. That's amazing. And it's still available on an ebook, but the paper version is out of print, which is terrible. Mm. And I would love to see it come back. The thing is, it's still so popular. I still get regular fan mail for that book, and it's been out of print for years. and it's become a multi-generational thing. You know, it's a father gives it to his child or his grandchild even.
Mm.
And I've even had a couple of times people have built replicas of Joe's trailer truck
Oh,
for their
cute.
children. Yeah, that's been a nice thing. Big Joe's trailer truck. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Hmm.
That was nice.
I see
It
it
was
at...
actually based on someone that I knew when I was a very little kid. He was a truck driver, and he was just this giant. I don't think I ever heard him speak. He was just this big, quiet man who I found interesting.
Oh.
And he ended up being the subject of and his name was Mac.
I was gonna say.
When I originally wrote it, I wrote it as Big Mac's trailer truck.
Right.
But my publisher said, Big Mac's not going to work. He said, first of all, that's a hamburger.
Right, yeah, exactly.
You'll be sued.
So I'm just going to go out on a limb here and assume that Big Joe was named after you.
Well, it was the first name that came to mind after Mac. So
I go to Value Village a lot, and I often see Big Joe's trailer truck there, and I always smile because it makes me think of you.
Oh, you do? Wow. Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So, final question. You have been to the set of Sesame Street a few times. Do you have, and I mean, you've told me some stories about when you were on the set of Sesame Street. Do you have any specific memories from when you were on the set that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Oh, gee. Well, if you have Busy City, I drew the set of Sesame Street in the book Busy City. I don't know if you've ever seen that book.
I have,
But, yep. We go around the city, and when we go to a television studio, it just happens to be Sesame Street. And I put myself, this little character, coming in with a portfolio into the side, and everyone's there, Jim and the whole gang. And sometimes it was brutal watching these take after take after take after take. It took forever sometimes to get the take to come together. They were all running around with puppets, and it was complete mayhem. It was a lot of fun to watch. And there was one day, I think I told you about this in an email. Jerry Nelson was doing Frazzle.
Oh, yeah.
And they had this big production number about what Frazzle feels. When he's happy, he goes, ah! When he's angry, he goes, ah! It's kind of the same sound all the time.
I love that skit. I love that skit.
And of course, he shakes the character, shakes Frazzle when he makes that noise, to make his tongue go flying, make the fur fly and everything. And they were on their 50th take or some ridiculous thing, you know. Every time, there was always someone that was in the wrong place and did something wrong, crashed into somebody, whatever. And it was getting late. And, you know, there were only so many trains back to where I lived, and I had to get out of there, but I couldn't leave the set. I had to see this finished. So they finally got a perfect take. It took forever. Everyone's exhausted. Poor Jerry's arm, holding that arm up for all afternoon and into the evening, shaking it like that. There's no blood in it. And it must hurt him like crazy.
I feel Jerry's pain.
As soon as he finished, Frazzle's face fell off.
Oh my God!
Everyone just groaned. Oh no! But apparently, Frazzle was not a Muppet that was made to be a full-time character.
Right.
It was basically the orange anything with a bunch of things pinned in place. And so the whole face just fell open, fell off. Well, they did one more take and they got it. We all went home.
Right.
But that was the saddest and at the same time funniest thing I think I'd ever seen in the studio. That was wonderful. Wonderful days.
Nice. Yeah, I noticed that Frazzle started out as just a generic monster, because there was a skit. Actually, one of my very favorite Sesame Street segments is, you probably have seen it. Cookie Monster is on Guy Smiley's Beat the Time game show, and he's given the task of bringing to the studio, you have to bring me 3 things, that's 3 things that rhyme with the word rain. And the first one is a cane that he steals from an old man who was also played by Jerry. The second one was a chain. And so he gives it to Guy. Guy's like, what's at the end of this chain? And then Frazzle comes out. And at the end of the skit, he just chases Guy with it. He looked like Frazzle looked so much, like with the chain around his neck, looked so much like Animal.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, that routine is sort of almost based on the old Kermit the Frog thing, which they did way, where he's sitting on a wall and he's singing this jazz tune. He's humming this jazz tune. I can't remember the name of the tune now. Doesn't matter. George Shearing tune, if you ever heard of him. Anyway, he keeps, these worms keep coming by and he keeps eating them as they come by. And finally he gets one, and it's a long one. It's actually the nose of a giant monster who ends up eating Kermit. And I think when I was in my early days hanging around the Muppet morgue, I think I found this or a similar monster. And it's on my website. I have him sort of about to engulf my head.
Looks like you were looking for the worm then.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So that wraps up the Q&A. Joe, is there anything else you'd like to say?
It's a lot of fun to talk with you about this. I don't know anyone that's more enthusiastic about the Muppets or the Sesame Street, or probably you know more about this stuff than anyone. And it's a lot of fun to share it with you and have a couple of laughs about it.
Oh well, I'm very glad that I've been that I've been able to have a few laughs with you over the years. For the viewers, this is actually the first time that Joe and I are having a face-to-face conversation like this. He was actually the first person who had any connection with the Muppets that I got in touch with, kind of.
Right?
Prior to that, I met Holly Robinson Peete, who is the daughter of Matt Robinson, the original Gordon and Roosevelt Franklin on Sesame Street. But she wasn't on the show for very long in the early years. You were the first person that I ever got in touch with who has had such a big history with the Muppets, and that's almost 10 years.
Oh, that's amazing. I was wondering how long it had been. But you were just a little kid at the time.
Yeah, I was about 11 or 12. I'm 21 now.
That's fantastic.
Nice.
I imagine you'll do great things. Looking forward to see where you end up.
Thank you very much, and to the viewers of Nostalgia Talk, peace!